Our mission here at Three Crosses is to transform the East Bay with the gospel of Jesus Christ as we gather, as we grow, and then as we go. And the go part of that ministry philosophy has always been the hardest. And what does it mean to take Jesus with us to work? What does it mean to take Jesus with us as we go into our schools this week? What does it mean to take Jesus with us as we go into our neighborhoods? And this morning, Dave Runyon has a message for us about what it means to go in our neighborhoods that'll be so simple, you will think, why haven't I thought of this before? Dave's book, The Art of Neighboring, is a fantastic. Just if you're on your phone, we assume it's because you're buying Dave's book. We'd love to put this in your hands because this strategy of bringing transformation into the place that God has placed you can change the world. And Paul says when he's preaching on Mars Hill that God has appointed the times and the places where each of us should live. And you live where you live, in this region, in this season, for a reason. And so let's put our hands together and welcome Dave Runyon as he comes up and shares with us the art of neighboring.
Thanks, Danny. Good morning. Oh, wait. Did I turn myself? Nope, I think I'm on. We good? How about now? Yes?
I think they want me to preach. I think that's what they said.
Will you,
Let's look. I see a green light.
Danny, can
Keep
you just
talking.
stand here next to me
Yeah.
and then just do this the entire time when I'm talking?
This is a translation thing we're going to do here.
Do you want me to try to go off that mic, or am I good? Oh,
Hey,
there we
I'm
are.
out of here. I'm going to McDonald's. See ya.
Thank you. Yes, that would be like a whole, you guys used to do illustrative sermons, I've told, so we could do like a whole thing right there. Good morning, Three Crosses. It's great to be here. I'm excited to be here with you. My daughter and my daughter's right here in the front row. We watched the 28-minute clip of the history of this church. If you've never done that, it's phenomenal. Like it like got me so excited to be here at this place that has such a rich history and a passion for pursuing people, becoming creative in ways that you can introduce other people to the good news of Jesus. And that's consumed my life as well. I served as a pastor in the Denver area for 10 years at two great churches. And during that time, I kind of had a series of mini crises that led me to do what I'm doing now, which now I help churches work together, mostly around issues with the poor, to demonstrate and to make tangible the gospel of Jesus in the Denver metro area. And it was during that time as a pastor, a couple of pieces of scripture just captured me. And one is found in John 17. John 17, the entire chapter is this incredible prayer of Jesus. It's the last recorded prayer that we have of him before he is crucified. And so in this incredibly crucial moment of his life, he prays. He prays this beautiful prayer, and he prays for himself, for what he's getting ready to go through. He prays for the disciples, and then he prays for all of us. He prays for every believer alive at that time and every believer to come. And in this moment of all the things that he prays for, he prays for unity. He prays for oneness. And he just says, I pray that those who follow me, those who believe, would be one. And he says, he doesn't just pray for unity for the sake of unity. He prays for unity, he says, because then when there's unity, people that don't know God will be drawn towards him. And I remember reading this as a pastor and thinking to myself, what if this is true? What if one of the best things we could do to help people come to God is simply to display unity among ourselves? And I remember just reading that and thinking about all the things that I was up to and thinking, I wonder what it would look like to put more time towards this. And not just unity among the people that were going to my church, but unity in the body in my part of the city. And so I began to have coffees and lunches and just make up excuses to hang out with different faith leaders and to just start to say, what would it look like for us to do this? And what I learned is that God was already moving in the hearts of a lot of other faith leaders. And so we started to gather together. And we started to say, and to dream about what would it look like to mobilize the body in our city. And we decided that we wanted to do that around mission, around caring for others. And then we had this horrible moment. We realized we didn't know the answer to this question, which is, if you could mobilize all the believers in one city, in one part of a city, what's the smartest thing you could do? And so we started to think about this for the northwest part of Denver. And we started to think, like, what's the smartest thing we could do if we're going to mobilize all of these people? We didn't know the answer to that question, which should be convicting to us. It was convicting to us as pastors. And so we started to hold these little gatherings where we'd bring in the mayor, the police chief, the city manager. And we'd just put them in the room with faith leaders, and we would just ask them, hey, share it with us your story. You know, how did you end up here doing what you're doing? By the way, the one good thing that government and faith leaders have in common is that neither one of them are doing it for a paycheck. Okay? And so it was cool to see some of the commonalities, that there was a calling among a lot of the civic leaders, the local government leaders in our area, just like there was a calling on a lot of the pastors, just there's a calling on a lot of you and the different things that you're up to. And so we would ask them to share their story, and then we would always say, okay, if you could wave a magic wand and change something in our city, what would you change? Or if you could get us all to work together towards one thing. And so we had our mayor in the room, and he take out this little piece of paper. And by the way, we tell the government leaders what we're going to ask them, because that's the only way that they'll show up. They don't think something weird's going to happen to them in the room. So he has this little prepared piece of paper, and he says, I want to live in a city where there's no financial debt. I want to live in a city where there's no single moms who live below the poverty line. I want to live in a city where there's no at-risk kids and there's no elderly shut-ins. And he just goes on all the way down this list. And there's 10 or 11 things. Most of them were really good. A couple of them were weird. He was like, we need a better newspaper. We're like, we can't help you with that. But anyway, so he gets down to the end. He puts this little piece of paper back in his pocket. And then very much in passing, he just says, if you really wanted to do something that would impact our city, you should start some kind of a neighboring movement. And then he just went on. We're like, whoa, go back to that. So we pressed him on it, and he said this. He said, what we're learning is that the majority of the issues in our community that our community is facing would be eliminated or drastically reduced if we could just become a community of people who are great neighbors. And he started to talk about the fact that, as a government leader, they were starting different programs for different people in need, and that they always get these phone calls, and people say, what do you have for this? And here's the situation I'm in. And he talked a little bit about this program that they were trying to start for isolated elderly, and they were going to spend all of this money to do this. And they said, but what we know is that if that person who doesn't have family around them lives in an apartment complex, a condo, a neighborhood, where they're known by their actual neighbors, that they get cared for out of relationship, and they actually don't need our programs. And he said this beautiful line. He said, what we're learning at the city is that relationships always trump programs. Now, put yourself in that room, okay? It's a bunch of people who make their living helping to teach the text, helping to encourage others and inspire others to follow the words and the teachings of God. Now imagine what it feels like when God uses that's your job, and then God uses your mayor to say, hey, by the way, the smartest thing you can do in our community is the most basic thing that Jesus said to do. When Jesus boils the entire text down to one thing, if you guys could do that, it would really bless our city. It was an awful moment. It was one of those gut punch moments, but it was also incredibly sacred. And our mayor didn't have any idea. He didn't see the irony that he was inviting us to do the Bible. Okay? But I did. And so did the people in the room. And so we prayed for him, and then we had this little discussion about what had just happened among the faith leaders there. And I remember just driving home, and I have 100 thoughts flowing through my head. And the two that I can remember are this. I remember thinking to myself, Jesus is smart. Yeah, you'd think as a pastor I'd have that thought a lot, right? Okay, and I remember just thinking to myself, is it possible that when Jesus is asked to boil the entire text down to one thing where he says, love God with everything you have, love God with your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and love your neighbors, is it possible that when Jesus was asked to boil the entire text down to one thing, is it possible that he gave us all a simple strategic plan that if we did it, if believers everywhere did it, it would literally change the world overnight? That was the first thought I had. And then the second thought, I remember just thinking to myself, I'm not doing it. I'm actively not doing it. I had this realization that I was involved in all of these other kinds of things as a pastor, and I had given my life to trying to, my vocational life, to trying to really engage people and help them live out the teachings of Jesus. And I remember just going, oh my goodness, I'm serving on these 3 different nonprofit boards, and I spend all of my time trying to help people and to do different things and events and programs, and I'd filled up my life with so much stuff that I didn't have margin to really deeply engage the people. I mean, I'd wave to them. You know, I remembered a couple of their names, but that was it because I was so busy doing all of this other stuff. And I remember going home, and I went in my house, and I processed what had happened with my wife. My wife's been ahead of me on most things in my life, and I remember her just looking at me and going, wow, what are you going to do about that? And I didn't want to, like, lock myself into any kind of, like, accountability. And so I was like, well, I'm just going to, like, spend more time in the front yard and, you know, just see what happens. That was it. That was my whole plan. And I will tell you this, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, just doing that one simple thing put me on a trajectory that started to disorient and change my life in a really, really good way. And I'll come back to that in just a second. I'll tell you what happened to that group of pastors who was in the room. After the mayor left, we're all like, hey, who's like really engaged in their own neighborhood? We kind of had this like, there was a couple of the 26 pastors that said yes, they were. The rest of us were like, and we just said, hey, can we just do this? Like, let's all make a commitment. Let's just pray about what happened here for a couple of months, for 8 weeks, and then let's come back together. And when we came back together, I invited in this woman. Her name is Vicki Ryer. She was our assistant city manager. Vicki had been like, I'd been going around annoying people with that magic wand question for a long time, and Vicki would always say the same thing, and this doesn't apply that much here in the context we're in, but she would always say, hey, Dave, you want to do something? Next time it snows, why don't you get all the people and all those churches to shovel their neighbor's driveway? I remember thinking, no. I wanted something like sexy, like, you know, the church eradicates homelessness or something, you know, something big. But when the mayor said the neighboring thing, I was like, oh no, Vicki has been trying to tell me this for like 2 years. And so we invite Vicki into the room. Vicki comes in and she just starts unloading all this great stats and context about why neighboring matters. She talks about Malcolm Gladwell's book where he talks about like how much like your connections with the people who live around you impact how long you live. The fact that like when there's a natural disaster or a crisis, your neighbors are almost always your first responders because the systems are overwhelmed. She quoted this guy from Robert Putnam from Bowling Alone and how crime rates are 82% less in neighborhoods where people know the first names of their neighbors. And we're just all sitting there going, oh my goodness, this is good. And we're also thinking, and Jesus said to do this, right? And then Vicki cements that we're going to do something in this one little line. We're doing Q&A with the pastors, and she looks at one of the pastors, and she wasn't trying to be mean at all, but she just said something very, very honest. And to answer one of the pastor's questions, she said, hey, listen, like from the city's perspective, there isn't a noticeable difference in how Christians and non-Christians neighbor in our community. And when we heard it, we like, it felt so awful to hear that. We're like, oh, come on, that's not, we like started to like, you know, push back on her, like, observation. And then we stopped and we realized she's right. Like, in our city, there wasn't a drastic noticeable difference in the way that the Christians and the non-Christians neighbored in our community to a point where city leaders would actually say, hey, like, we can see this. And by the way, I've shared this quote now in rooms with city leaders from over 500 different cities. Never once has a civic leader come up to me and said, oh, Dave, in our city, the Christians are the best neighbors, right? No, we kind of laugh. We're like, but like that should be something that we actually sit with. Like, how do we get here? If the text says, listen, if you only do one thing, love God with everything you have and love your neighbors yourself, and yet there's not a drastic, noticeable difference in the way Christians neighbor in our cities and our communities, we need to ask ourselves, what in the world is going on? Like, how is that possible? And I remember starting to like get frustrated when I started to think about that. And you ever like, I'm sure this hasn't happened to you recently at all, like you see something on the news and you start to get angry and irritable, okay? Like I started to feel like that about this question. And then I changed the question and it started to change my mood. I started to ask, I wonder how you become a pastor who's not engaged in his own neighborhood. And I went from being angry and irritable to reflective and convicted. And I began to read passages that I had taught multiple sermons on that I had read hundreds of times, and they just started to take on a new light. And I'm going to share one of them with you here today. It's found in Luke 10. And as I've shared my journey with others, I've come to realize that many of us, especially those of us that have grown up in the church, that many of us have become inoculated to the Great Commandment. It's one of those things that we've heard over and over and over again, but that we've lost touch with the true meaning. And so today I want to invite you to look at this story that you've probably heard multiple times, that you've probably read a lot of times into the double digits, and to just say, God, would you just help us to see this with new eyes? Would you help us to just see this with a freshness as we look through this incredible little narrative here of what happens between Jesus and this expert in the law, this pastor-type person. Luke 10:25 says this. It says, on one occasion, an expert in the law stood up to test Jesus. Teacher, he asked, what must I do to inherit eternal life? What is written in the law, he replied. How do you read it? Jesus does this a couple times throughout the text. He says, all right, I'm going to invite you to answer your own question. So he, this teacher of the law, this priest, the pastor guy, says, love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength and with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. Verse 28, you have answered correctly, Jesus replied, do this and you will live. We could just spend the rest of the time there. Just looks at this guy and goes, that is the perfect textbook answer. If you just do this, you will truly live. But here's the part. Here's the part that just came flying off the page. You ever one of those moments where you're reading through it and you see yourself in the story? Verse 29, it says this, but he wanted to justify himself. So he asked Jesus, and who is my neighbor? But this guy gives the perfect textbook answer. Jesus affirms him. And then his first thought is, I wonder if there's a loophole. I wonder, how do I get out of it? But he wanted to justify himself, so he asked Jesus, and here's how he tries to get out of it. In an effort to get out of it, he plays the define the word game. You ever done this? Okay, he's like, Jesus, neighbor, what does that really mean? He tries to define the word neighbor so that it most easily fits into what he's already up to. This is where I saw myself in the story. Okay? His first thought is, what does that word really mean? Do you want to know how to become a pastor who's not engaged in his own neighborhood? Here is the playbook. You just have to define that word neighbor. You got to play what does the word neighbor mean? You see, I had read this passage over and over and over again, and then I just chose to define the word neighbor in these nice, big, general, vague terms. And the way that I did that was because what Jesus does next. I just used this next part to kind of do some mental gymnastic moves so that I didn't actually have to spend time with my actual neighbors, okay? So what Jesus does in response to this question of who is my neighbor is he just blows up the definition of neighbor on this guy, and he tells the story of the Good Samaritan, okay? We all know the story of the Good Samaritan, okay? When you care for the person in front of you, okay, that is an act of loving your neighbor. No matter where you are, no matter who it is. Okay, even though there's a Samaritan who is doing the act of love, no matter where you are, no matter who it is, when you care for the person in front of you, in Jesus' economy, that's an act of loving your neighbor. Okay, now how I interpreted that passage for a lot of my life is everybody's my neighbor. Now there's a big difference between everybody's my neighbor and when you care for the person in front of you, no matter where you are, you see the difference? But for me, I just made that one little jump to everybody's my neighbor. And I just kind of started to realize, wow, I'm just kind of a loving guy. I'm in ministry. I'm just kind of loving my neighbor all the time. You like that? Now, here's the only problem with that, okay? When everybody's your neighbor, often nobody is. When you aim for everything, it's easy to hit nothing. And so what I realized is that maybe I didn't, what Jesus does here in the story of the Good Samaritan is he gives AP neighboring, okay? Now, he's assuming that this Jewish guy, is loving his own actual neighbors, and so he's stretching out the definition to give him the graduate level course. But he's assuming that he's loving the people right around him. That's why he's telling the Samaritan piece of this story. And I started to realize, hey, maybe I don't need graduate level neighboring right now. Maybe what I need is kindergarten. Okay, maybe I've skipped some steps here somehow, and I wonder if there would be great power in just drawing a circle around the places that God has put me, and then beginning first to work out from there. And my friends and I, my other pastor friends and I, we started to do that as well. And we started to see incredible things happen. We started to realize that there's something sacred as Danny said, about the place that God has put us. And so we, with the help of like our little city leader, we came up with this little tic-tac-toe. I'm gonna do a test with you, okay? We're all gonna do a test together. You can just kind of do this on the screen. Here's the test. You ready? You walk outside the front door of your house, your apartment, your condo, your ranch, whoever you are in this room, you've got neighbors. You walk outside the front door. Now just think about, you don't have to take this literally, like it's 8, but like who are the 8 closest units to you? Okay, you got them in your head. You can kind of see it right now. All right, now right now I want you to take a second. If you have a little pen, if you take notes, you can do this and just write it out. If you want to, you can do it in your head. So I want you to take a second. I want you to like start to list off who are let's go with adults. Who are the adults that live in those 8 units? Just take a second right now. I'm going to ask you how many of these that you can actually do. Okay, if there's 2 adults, can you do both adults there? If there's just one, what does that look like? If there's a dog, if you're feeling really good about it, you can name the dog, that's fine too. But just take a second, think through the 8 closest units. How many of those people can you name? All right, how many of you right now, this is audience participation time, how many of you go, I can do all 8? I've got the names of the people in all 8. Raise your hand. Okay. How many of you right now, if I called you up here on stage, you could say, I can do the names of the adults in 5 or more of those boxes? Raise your hand. Put it up there. Okay. 30% of the room? Maybe 4. I'll go generous and say 40, okay? That would be, actually, it's really 30. I want to tell you this. I have never been in a room of Christians where more than half of the room says that they can list off more than half of their neighbors' names. I've been doing this for 10 years now. My buddy and I wrote this book. We thought like our moms would have a book on their bookshelf and tell people that their kids wrote a book. Okay, it's so simple. We had no idea that it would actually get traction. Okay, but I've been able to do this now. I've passed out over 600,000 of these little refrigerator magnets that you're going to get when you walk out the door today. Okay, so I've done this a lot. I've never been in a room, okay, where more than half of the Christians can list off and write down in concrete the names of more than half of their neighbors. Here's why that matters. Okay, in order to love somebody, it's helpful to know their first name. Right? Okay, can we just agree on that? Now, here's how I felt when I did this for the first time. I could do both adults in 2 of these boxes. I had met all of these people, okay? But I could only, when I sat down to do this for the first time, I could only list off both adults' names in 2 of these 8 boxes. And I remember I didn't have this cool little magnet that you're going to get. I had a little napkin, and it was sitting on my fridge. And again, my wife, she could have written down a lot more, but she's mean. And so she didn't. And she just left them blank, and I just stare at those blank squares, just like you were going to when you go home and put this on your fridge. But God did something inside of me, and I remember thinking, okay, I'm going to do this. I'm not, and by the way, I'm not going to ask you to do anything crazy today. Like, we're in a series called You're Invited. I'm not inviting you to love your neighbor, okay? I'm inviting you to learn your neighbor's names, okay? Like, we're going to set the bar so low that you can't crawl underneath it today, okay? But I'm going to ask you to go home and put this on your fridge and just learn your neighbors' names, because I know that it's a Trojan horse to get you to do all kinds of other stuff with some of them. Okay, some of these people, you're just going to learn their names, and they're going to be like that neighbor who just like the garage goes up, it goes down. You'll learn their name, and that's it. I'm going to invite you to learn their name and to use their name when you see them, because I know some of your neighbors, it's going to mess you up. Some of your neighbors are going to lean back towards you, and I know that because that's what happened in my own life, and I've heard story after story after story of others, and this happening the same way. Okay, what happened to me was I went from, and I'll never forget this, one of those like little blank squares was sitting out there in my little cul-de-sac, and he was mowing his lawn, and I remember going out front, and I saw him, and I was like, oh, this is a good chance. I need to go meet him. He's one of the people that I've met before and that I don't know his name. And I'm like, before I even took a step, I was like, oh, I can't go meet him like while he's mowing his lawn. That's weird. And I thought to myself, I'll do this. I'll just kind of like hang out in my front yard until he's done. And I was like, oh, that's even weirder. And then I remember thinking, I'll go inside, and I bet when I come out, and then I just stop. I'm like, I'm doing it. I'm trying to get out of this. I'll never forget just like taking that first step. And by the way, the key to being a good neighbor is like having the courage to lean into mildly awkward moments. That's all you have to do. Okay, so I remember taking that first step down my driveway. I remember I walked down my driveway, and I walked across, and he's mowing his lawn. And then he's, I'm not running over. It's not an emergency, but he's kind of looking. He's like, what do you, and I walked up and he stopped the lawnmower. And I'll just never forget. I go, hey, man. And that was my name for this guy. Another guy was bro. I kept them totally separate. And I was like, thought that was really, but I was like, hey, man, it's really embarrassing. I know we've met 3 times. I know I've lived here for almost 2 years. I forgot your first name. And he said, I'm Matt. And then I said, I'm Dave. And he said something horrible. He said, I know. And he's like, and this is my wife, Jan. And then, and it was like a 20-second conversation. And then I went back inside my house and I did something really important. What'd I do? I wrote it down. So if you're willing to do this, by the way, I would highly suggest just write it down. Write it down in a place that you're going to see. Okay, and then, by the way, there's no, we didn't put 3crosses.com, come on, whatever. It's just like a little thing. So when your neighbor, someday if you do this well, I know this because it's happened to me, your neighbor's going to go, why is my name on your fridge? Okay, and I'll just be like, dude, we like to remember our neighbors' names. Do you want one of these? Okay, it's really simple. But it went from, hey, man, to hey, Matt, to, hey, Matt, did you see the end of that Nuggets game? Okay, to, hey, I've just got this thing in my garage. I need to move 10 feet. Could you help me out? To, hey, your son's car is back. Is he back living with you guys now? How's that going? To sitting across my dining room table, sharing our stories with each other. The good stuff, the stuff I had always dreamed about when I was setting up the chairs at a different event of the church. It was all sitting right there for me. And all I had to do was stop making this idea of loving my neighbor into a metaphor and make it into something concrete and tangible. All I had to do is go back to kindergarten. Now, I want to be really clear about a couple of things. Clearly, in Jesus' economy, the stuff that we do downtown, serving at the rescue mission, the stuff that you do overseas, the stuff that you do at work, which you're going to talk about next week, all of that, I want to be really clear. The stuff you do with the other parents on your kids' sports team, that's loving your neighbor. I don't want to diminish any of that. It has enormous value. Keep doing it. Okay? But here's the deal. All of that doesn't sprinkle magic fairy dust over our neighborhoods, and all of a sudden Jesus isn't talking about them. Okay? So don't hear me diminishing anything else. Clearly loving your neighbor is bigger than just your actual neighbors. Okay? But just because we're doing all this stuff doesn't mean that Jesus wasn't talking about our neighbors. And there's something really potent and really powerful when we start building relationships based on proximity. Okay? There is something really, really powerful, because if you start to get to know the people that live around you, you're going to guarantee yourself that you're hanging out with people that don't think about the world the way you do. Okay? And that is where God wants us. God wants us to come in here and to get equipped, but this isn't the end game. The end game is when we, as Jesus people, go back out into our neighborhoods, into our world. And this is the antidote to the Christian bubble, is building proximity-based relationships. And by the way, it's the antidote to how sick and polarized a lot of our culture is. Because when we start building relationships and friendships with people who aren't like us, who don't think about the world like us, it starts to build connectivity, and it plays defense on the whole polarization thing. Okay, does that make sense? It's where God wants us. It's where he wants us. He wants us in the mix. And so some of your neighbors, I'm going to give you a couple tips that I've learned along the way. I've got some weird competitive stuff in me, and so I thought those neighbors who clearly don't want anything to do with me, I thought it was some kind of challenge to stalk them. Don't do that, okay? It's bad. It's a bad idea. Don't do that. Okay, in fact, earlier in Luke 10, Jesus talks about finding the person of peace. Look for the people who kind of lean towards you. Look for the people who there's some kind of openness there. And by the way, sometimes they're going to be the hardest people to hang out with. Okay, because they're really needy. It turns out God actually has a heart for people in need, so you should just do that. Get over it, get into some uncomfortable places and just spend time with the people who lean towards you. The fruit that you will see come of it is unbelievable. Okay, and then I would just tell you, just take the next small step. Just take the next small step. Okay, so if you don't know some of your neighbors' names that are the 8 close neighbors' names, just learn them. And you can go Google this stuff. You can get on Nextdoor and do all that kind of stuff. It's like that's an artificial way of doing this. There's something beautiful that happens when you have a face-to-face interaction with somebody. There's something great that happens when you just look at somebody and go, this isn't, like, I know I've met you before and I don't know your name. Like by the way, that's like a small little act of vulnerability that we can give to others that builds context for a real relationship. And so, like having those, you could go and look in their mailbox and find out their name and write all their names down. Don't do that. I think that's like illegal. So if you let this sink in, it will ruin you in a good way. It will change the way you drive in and out of your neighborhood. You'll start to see there's something sacred going on. Danny just talked about that passage in Acts chapter 17. I love that passage. Like Paul is sitting there and he's talking to all these people. He's sitting up on this little place called Mars Hill. And he's talking to all the people, and they ask him, like, who is this God? And he gets to share about the character and the nature of God. And as he's sharing about that, he shares, he says, from one man he made every nation of men that they should inhabit the whole earth. And so God determined the time set for them in the exact places where they should live. God did this so that men would seek him and perhaps reach out for him and find him, though he is not far from each one of us. God has determined where we live and who lives around us. And when that sinks in, it's game over. Like we start to go, there's something bigger going on here. And he doesn't just say, he says, so that when people seek out for him and perhaps reach out for him, like, so that and I love the imagery, they'll have handles to grab onto when they seek God. I've seen this over and over again. It feels so basic, by the way. Okay, so like, by the way, just learning and using people's names often sends you on a trajectory towards real relationship and towards loving the people who live right around you. And here for me, this is where this gets really, really exciting. Here's what's possible. Okay, so just here at this church, at Three Crosses, there's about 1,200 families, households, that call this place home. Okay, that means that if each one of you right here in this room say, you know what, I'm just going to take this magnet that I'm going to get when I go out of here, I'm going to write down these people's names, and then I'm going to just start praying this prayer of like, God, what's the next small step that you want me to take with one of my neighbors? God, what's the next small step? If just the people in this room do that, if we start taking the Great Commandment literally and seriously, if we just do that, okay, that means that this one church can impact well over, just under 10,000 households. Okay? And let's go low. Let's say in each of those households there's an average of 3 people. That means if Three Crosses takes this literally and seriously, if you go home and say, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do my part, that's over 28,000 human lives that can be touched through this one church. And this isn't a program. This is just like, hey, I'm going to like learn the people's names that God has put right around me. And I'm going to pray and say, God, what's the next small step that I can take with each one of them? And it's going to be messy, and you're going to see that, you're going to go, wow, like that's a lot, okay? And there's going to be things that are hard, and there's going to be things that are beautiful. And I know this because I've experienced this in my own life. And we'll take a little bit, if you have time, and you want to come back this afternoon around 1, we'll like do the 2.0 stuff and take a little bit of a deeper dive. I want to leave you with this quote. A friend of mine said this. He said, in this life, we can only do a few things really, really well. I think that it would be wise to make sure that one of them is the thing that Jesus said matters most. As you leave here, I hope you'll grab one of these. You can grab a couple, grab something for your neighbor, leave some for the second service. But I hope you put this on your fridge. I hope it's just a reminder. I hope it's something that you use. I hope that it messes you up the same way that it messed me up. Let's pray. God, thanks for giving us this incredible command that has the potential to do so much for us and for the people that live around us. God, would you give us a passion, a desire to take the Great Commandment literally and seriously. Help us to make the time to build relationships with the people that you've placed right around us. God, give us the courage to live the kind of lives that you want us to live. God, help us to remember that the way that Jesus talks about living, it really is the smartest and best way to live. And God, help us to emulate that in our daily lives. In your name, amen.